something different now. First, are eco-protesters the biggest threat to the environment is what we're asking. 0207 862 2222 is the number to give us a ring with your thoughts. The Energy Secretary, Claire Curtino, has accused so-called eco-zealots of turning people against environmentalism. Speaking to the Spectator magazine, Ms Curtino said the biggest threat to the cause isn't the climate change deniers, it is the zealots who are turning people off. She went on to say that the government's new climate agenda is good for the planet and the people too, but was she right to say this, Yasmin? Are they turning people off the cause?
No, absolutely not. It's hard. Of course, a lot of people, but fewer people in Europe than here are resistant because we all have to make sacrifices and we hate it, and I hate it. I hate it. But the planet is dying.
But are they taking the right approach in telling us that news? They seem to be targeting the wrong people.
The biggest danger to, the planet are Tory zealots who have now decided, after taking us some of the way towards what needs to be done, realising after the Uxbridge victory by a small majority, if we go big on anti-climate policies, we'll win the election. That's fine. That's an election ploy. That's a strategy. That's fine. But please, I was astonished. She says the alternative for Germany, for example, this party that is gaining a lot of support in Germany, actually, they are absolutely tied to a very hard right approach to immigrants. Some people describe them as neo-fascists. So to say this just about eco-policies is wrong and misleading on the part of Ms Coutinho. We need to act.
That's
we need to act now.
People do get very, very cross at eco-protesters when they block off the M25, when they're up in the Dartford crossing.
Yeah, I was about to say gluing yourself to the Dartford crossing.
Oh, I would love to do that if I was younger.
Trust me, getting the glue off is probably a bigger issue. Look, I think it's slightly hyperbolic to say that they are a bigger threat to the climate. But I do see where she's coming from in the sense that I think they draw attention to the wrong things. We're looking at their antics as opposed to their message. And whether you agree with it or not, I think, you have to point out that they're behaving in a very moronic way. But I think most people's frustration with, I suppose, in the case of the climate, the net zero agenda, is they don't think politicians have been honest about the actual practical implications of what this would mean in terms of their lives. So how much more would they be paying on certain things? What does technology look like moving forward? All of that. I think that's the bigger issue. I think to wrap that into a whole different conversation of actually you're a climate change denier, I don't think that's very fair. People want to know what their lives is going to look like, how much it's going to cost them. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. I think skepticism to actually the realities of this transition is perfectly valid. And I think that's probably what she should be addressing more. I've always said that my reservations with sort of these eco-protesters, the ones that are gluing themselves to the Dartford crossing, for example, is they actually have a very kind of narrow-minded view on this issue. So, for instance, I say most people, when they talk about tackling climate change, don't actually consider what the third world would look like, what farmers in developing countries, how their lives will be changed by, access to certain types of fertilizers and all of that. I think that's completely missing from the conversation. And so when we actually talk about climate change, it's very Western-centric, it's very, middle-class, North London-centric, as opposed to a more global perspective, which we need if we're going to get anywhere on this.
Alexis, what is your reaction to these comments? Because they're quite startling.
I think that they are questionable. I don't see how you can justify calling people who passionately care about the state of the planet as the biggest threat to the planet. I think perhaps the biggest threat to the planet may be new drilling licences just being granted by the government. But I think there is a point to be said about how do you win people's support? And we have talked about it on these shows plenty of times that is protesting, like the Just Stop Oil protests that we've seen, are they getting people on their side? Now, many people will say that's the wrong way to protest. There are better ways to protest. But I'll never forget the young girl, apologies, I forget her name, who had climbed up on a gantry at the M25. She seemed petrified. She seemed upset. She seemed distressed. But she felt like she had to do it. And I think you can't ignore that. And certainly for any climate minister to say this young lady, is a biggest threat to the planet than anything else, I think that's misguided.
But you and I do these debates quite often, and when we do it, there is a large number of people will call in to complain about the way that these protesters go about their business, and more specifically than that, who they are targeting. So I wonder whether Claire Coutinho actually has a point here in terms of their tactics, not necessarily, you know, what they do, but how they do it. We'll go to the phones now. We're going to speak to Dr. Grahame Buss, who is a spokesperson for Just Stop Oil, but that hasn't always been your purpose, Grahame. You did at one point work for Shell, of all places.
I did, yes.
So what do you think about Claire Coutinho's comments?
I think they're absurd. Look, sometimes you have to tell the truth. You have to tell the facts. And governments have kicked the can down the road for, 30, 40 years or so. And this government is continuing to do the same. Now, we are truth tellers in Just Stop Oil. And by the way, the young lady you mentioned on the gantry, that was Louise, and she's a wonderful person, someone I admire very greatly. Look, at the fire brigade today, only today, was saying that they are under-resourced to deal with wildfires in the UK. The Environment Agency has been saying for years that they're under-resourced to deal with the consequences of climate change. We look at crop failures in southern Europe, and even in this country last year we saw significant crop failures. And, you know, we're seeing incurable tropical diseases moving north as the temperature rises. There's already in Paris, they have a mosquito which causes two incurable diseases, one called Zika and one called dengue. That's going to come here if we don't make the changes we have to make.
Grahame, I don't think...
People going on holiday, 40 degrees C, that's withering heat. How is that a holiday?
I mean, I don't think many people across the country will disagree with the fact that the climate crisis is an incredibly important issue that we need to focus on.
Well, the government does.
Well, but
government doesn't agree with that, does it? They're quite happy. They're quite happy to break all their promises, to not stop new oil and gas licenses.
I hear you. Let's put to one side what the government is doing, and I just want to focus on this comment that Claire Coutinho made, because there is a sort of feeling that people like Just Stop Oil, like yourself, are kind of losing the public vote. You're losing public support on something that the public already agree with you on. This should be an easy get. And yet, this sort of thing really rubs the public up the wrong way. I'd say that, and more specifically, the stopping of traffic on busy roads.
Look, if I can answer that. I know many, many people who are concerned about the climate crisis but take no action at all. And unless people are prepared to take... It's not good enough just to be worried. It's not good enough to wake up in the night sweating with fear about the future.
But Grahame, how do we encourage people to take action?
Pardon?
How do we encourage people to take action? Because clearly this isn't working.
Doing yourself to death a tunnel is not a good way, I would say.
Listen, I want to agree with every word Grahame has said. When the suffragettes did what they did, this is exactly what they said. We agree, of course, but the tactics are wrong. The tactics are always wrong. And the tactics have to push the boundaries. Okay?
Okay. So you think that, what is Claire Coutinho doing then? Maybe she is misdirecting?
Of course she's misdirecting. You look, she's yet another Energy Secretary for what used to be called Business Energy. Well, they've changed their name, haven't they? To the department that she runs. She's Energy Secretary. And they've had, 6 Energy Secretaries, I think, since 1921. None of them know their brief, do they? They don't know their brief because they're in there for such short periods of time. All they do is spout the nonsense from the government, who is desperately trying to increase its votes. She does not know her brief. If she bothered to read the work that her own department has written, which I have read, I read this stuff, that she would know how serious it is. Our government have said we face an existential risk. And for your listeners, existential here means the possibility we could all die. We have to address the climate crisis. And I know it's hard for government to do. They don't like facing the facts, but they do do have to make changes.
Dr. Grahame
And
Buss,
very
thank you
first thing
very
you have
much
to
for
do-
joining us for this conversation. We're going to have to move on because we want to get more callers there. But spokesperson for Just Stop Oil, George from Edinburgh, do you think that Claire Coutinho has a point here, that maybe these eco-protesters are turning people away from the cause rather than towards it?
I don't think they're turning people away from it, but what I would like to know is there's no way that 100% of these eco-warriors or eco-zealots they want to call are arriving there by electric car or by bus or by bike.
George, that's a bit of an odd argument, isn't it? Because the infrastructure isn't there to allow them to be completely eco-friendly, although they probably would want to be. So to say, oh, you got there in a bus that used petrol, is like, well, there wasn't one that used electricity available. And even if there was, the electricity that we're getting predominantly now isn't from eco-friendly energy sources, isn't from renewables. So we just don't have the infrastructure. What, are they going to come in canoe? I don't know how you want them to get there.
I don't understand why you could be so flippant about it. I think industry is the biggest trouble to the environment. But the thing is these people are being so high and mighty about what they believe in that you're trying to tell me that they'll never go on holiday again, they'll never go by plane, they'll never travel somewhere, or they only go.
But George, you're right, it's not necessarily about one person, it is about industry, it's about big companies making big decisions that would have more of an impact on you and I getting on an EasyJet flight, for example. But I hear your point. I mean, maybe they could make more changes. Thank you very much for your call. I'm not sure we got to the end of that one either. Let's find out what else is happening this lunchtime. Alexis, what are you kicking off with?
Well, actually, we're not that far off what we've just been discussing now. We're asking whether Rishi Sunak is right to be prioritising car owners, drivers. We're being told that in the Conservative Party conference, which starts this Sunday, part of the Prime Minister's big speech will include a sort of a scaling back on how many councils can impose, for example, 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. He doesn't want councils to be using ANPR cameras, the automatic number plate recognition cameras, to spot people who are sort of going in those sort of boxes, for example, and giving them fines. He wants bus routes to be made more available to cars, etc., etc. This coming off the back of course, that big by-election win concerning ULEZ. The idea is now we need to be kind and polite and more accommodating, let's put it this way, to the motorist, to the driver in particular.
It's a sellout.
Yasmin, what do you think?
You know, it's a sellout. And it's really interesting. The one person who really understood this in the Tory party was Alok Sharma. Right? He really was somebody who they should have valued because he understood the need for real change. And, I mean, he was a gift to them. He's now decided to quit.
He's no longer standing in the next general
You have
election.
to ask, the thing is, because you have to ask why. No one will put forward policies that they think is going to lose them an election. Generally, parties exist to try and win elections. So you have to ask, actually, probably don't put the onus on, Rishi Sunak for implementing these policies. Why does he think they will be popular? And that's the question, because I think actually in a lot of these conversations we kind of infantilize the electorate and we talk about them in certain binaries that I feel uncomfortable with. We talk about people who drive cars, for instance, as if they're all rich people living in Kensington, when actually cars are a necessity for pensioners, for young women like myself who travel and work at night, for people who work in the NHS, for nurses, for instance, that need to drive to work and all of that. So we actually need to contextualize who actually uses cars, who needs cars, who uses cars that are less likely to be ULEZ friendly, why? And then we need to tackle it from that position, because then we'll actually understand why people are making these decisions in their lives that we're so uncomfortable with because of the impact on the environment, instead of just saying, actually, the Conservative Party has given up. They're actually listening to people that will probably vote for them on the basis of this because they're not necessarily comfortable with the travel of
But you must always remember history.
That we're going.
When they brought in the seatbelt legislation, the country was in uproar. When they brought in the drink driving laws, the country was in uproar, but they went ahead with it.
You cannot compare that to charging people for driving their cars.
Of course you can.
Putting a seatbelt on is free.
You're both very welcome to come and join me on the panel as well. We can make it 4 people there, but we've got to close this conversation up now. That's what Esther and Yasmin think. We want to find out what you think. Is Rishi